Big topics, big ideas, and practical policy solutions. This is Leaders on the Frontier with your host, David Leis.
Well, hi, everybody. It is Thursday, November the 14th, and my name is David Leis, your proud host of Leaders on the Frontier, and welcome, everybody. I'm really excited about today's show as we have a very interesting virtual event, a book launch about a special book. It's called Unjustified, and we'll get to that in a moment. It's really quite a stunning book. It is just filled with revelations about the illegal invocation or use of the Emergencies Measures Act and kind of the associated stories and lessons learned about that. So we've got not only the author Ray McGinnis joining us, but also a team of, I think, some really extraordinary voices that can bring perspective to the significance of this work. Why does this matter to really every Canadian and to you? So a warm welcome to the audience, and we're certainly really keen on your questions and your comments, and we do appreciate them a lot. I did want to highlight a few headlines and observations. This week has been a very busy week. It's kind of like, where do we begin? But I would be remiss if I didn't begin with, of course, remembering Remembrance Day. And what did you do on Remembrance Day? That's a question to you. That's an important tradition where, as Canadians, we come together in unity to recognize the incredible sacrifices that people who made the ultimate price for our rights and freedoms that perhaps we take for granted. I would like to recommend an inspiring article. You can find it on the Frontier website. It's by Dr. Jerry Bowler. He's a historian, and he talks about the history and significance of those sacrifices that Canadians have made over the years. So please look at that. I think it's also interesting how some seek to, dare I say, politicize Remembrance Day. And you've heard a lot about how some anti-Israeli and, quote, decolonial activists have targeted some ceremonies for their purposes. And I'd say, well, it's incredibly disappointing. But what do you think about that? I'd also like to highlight the passing of a premier of British Columbia, John Horgan. He passed away this week, and there was some very, I think, heartfelt condolences to him and him as not just as a political leader of British Columbia, but also as a human being. In fact, a quote that I found very interesting this week was, "What made him so remarkable was just the ability to connect with people. It didn't matter who you were, what you did. He was able to sit down and have a conversation, have a beer, whatever, whether you agreed with politics or you didn't agree with politics." And that's from BC Public Safety Minister Mike Farnsworth. So I thought that was a really touching moment where people may agree to disagree, but they can still grieve together the loss of another fellow human being. Speaking of potential losses, tomorrow we'll see if there is going to be a postal strike. Postal workers are set to strike on Friday, so let's stay tuned. It's a very interesting situation as they have a kind of obviously a monopoly, and I think the use of the public postal service is quite low and continues to decline. But what do you think? And on another news, we of course remember on November the 5th the election of our U.S. neighbors, where the so-called deplorables struck back. And it was a stunning victory for the GOP, with Donald Trump back not only in the White House, but also the GOP now confirmed to take over the House in the Congress, as well as the U.S. Senate. And he also won the popular vote. Were you surprised by that election outcome? What does that mean for Canada? And that's certainly the questions that we're all chewing on. And I think a number of people were not surprised by that electoral outcome. Certainly if you look at, I think, what I call real pollsters like Rasmussen, if I can be so bold, but also some were very surprised. So what do you think? Were you surprised by that U.S. election, and what does that mean for Canada? So that's a topic for another day, but very important that we're chewing on this week. And then finally, I noticed, interestingly enough, today, a study that urges doctors to never use certain phrases with patients. You may have seen that. Things such as, she will not get better, phrases like withdrawing care, phrases like circling the drain, or do you want us to do everything? Well, gosh, it's bedside matter, really bedside manner, pardon me, for physicians matter. And I thought that study was almost kind of humorous. But anyways, so today's program is an exciting day where we celebrate the launch of a book that has just been released by the Frontier Center and published in concert with Southern House. It's called Unjustified, and it is about the Freedom Convoy, the Emergencies Act, and the inquiry that got it wrong. And you can see a picture there of the cover. You can find it on Amazon, and you can also order it through Frontier. But this is an extraordinary book by Ray McGinnis, and I want to introduce Ray now. Ray is a senior fellow at Frontier. He's a researcher. He's someone that is a friend, and he's someone that has, I think, a remarkable set of skills as a researcher, as you have dared to tell the story of the convoy and the use of the Emergencies Act. And we'll never forget in January 22, where protesters traveled to Ottawa seeking to debate the Canadian government's pandemic measures that had caused widespread bankruptcies, suicides, domestic abuse, addictions, and overdoses. It's an extraordinary story. So, Ray, a warm welcome to you.
Good to be with you.
I also, and congratulations on the release of this book. And I also want to offer a warm welcome to Vice President of Research at Frontier, Dr. Marco Navarro-Genie. Welcome, Marco.
Good afternoon.
And also, we're really glad to have a special guest, Jason Lavigne from The Lavigne Show. Welcome, Jason.
Thank you, David. Thank you for having me.
And a warm welcome to our audience. I see Matthew coming on board. Good afternoon, all. And Ray, I want to begin with you because there's so much to look at here. But why did you write this book, Ray?
Well, I wrote I'm the accidental author on this because I'm not somebody who had a big circle of friends who were truck drivers. I wrote the book because since the Emergencies Act, after it was declared, I'd written one article, not being someone with a long suit in being an employee with the media at all. I got one article on Dissident Voice, which is more of a progressive left website in the States, about the invocation of the Emergencies Act on the weekend of the 19th, 20th of February, 2022. And so I kept on writing articles. I went to the Public Order Emergency Commission and sat through a week of the testimony. And I wrote a long 7,000 word piece in Covert Action magazine over in Washington, D.C. after the report was released. And at that point, I ended up on about 6 or 7 podcasts, and I was urged to write a book. And so then I wrote it. I began writing it and happened to mention it to you, and you said, "Oh, we'd be interested in it." So it happened. So that's the short answer.
Well, it's been a long journey, Ray. Many conversations, and a birth of a book happens. It's quite remarkable. So congratulations. It's interesting. You have a lot of accolades for this book because I think people, when they read it, will find out things they would just like. Truth is stranger than fiction is the phrase that comes to my mind. But I want to read a quote. It says, "Unjustified is one of the most important books of our time. Ray does a deep dive into the false narratives created and perpetrated by Canada's ruling party in partnership with the legacy media, and shows how the judiciary system is being weaponized against everyday Canadian citizens who voice their concerns. It's a must-read for anyone seeking the jaw-dropping truth around the Freedom Convoy, the POEC, and the ongoing persecution of Canadian political prisoners." And that quote is from none other than Tamara Leach, and she is the author of Hold the Line, My Story from the Heart of the Freedom Convoy. And of course, Tamara Leach played a pivotal role in really that movement, the convoy. And so congratulations on that quote. And you've got so many others. But Ray, I guess the question I have for you is, when we say false narratives, is it really clear that it was, what do you mean by false narratives here in this book?
Well, there was in the news there was, and from the press conferences by different cabinet ministers and the prime minister, everything but the kitchen sink was being thrown at the protesters even before they arrived, being depicted as white supremacists, misogynists, racists, and so on. And so, I mean, I didn't know, I wasn't in Ottawa, but I happened to go to I happened to walk through a protest in Sympathy in Vancouver on the way to an Apple store to get something in my computer fixed. And it happened to be that the person who was speaking at a podium on Robson Street in Vancouver was Anita Krishna, who is an Indo-Canadian woman who'd been with Global TV for 20 years. And she said, what you're seeing here today, all of you people protesting in Vancouver in Sympathy, what's happening in Ottawa will not be reported on the news tonight. And that was also what was going on. People like Rodney Palmer, who had a long career in journalism, was videotaping for the first 5 or 6 days, and in Ottawa, and it was like Canada Day in the winter, being described that way. All this joy and peaceful behavior, and then he would turn on the news and see how it was being depicted. It was like 180 degrees in the opposite direction. And so, one example would be the story about how protesters had come to Ottawa to start burning apartment buildings of residents in Ottawa, and that whole story was puffed up. The mayor of Ottawa and others decrying the violence and bad behavior of the protesters. And the police, said days after that the people that are under suspicion for this failed attempt at arson in this apartment building are people who are well known to us in Ottawa and who have nothing to do with the protest. But nonetheless, there are people who will say to me today, as an article of faith, that they are certain the protesters were involved in trying to burn down an apartment building. So that and many other things are examples of the false narrative. Also the whole idea that this was that what was going on, the protest constituted a national threat to the country. At no point did the police watching the protest with undercover agents walking among the protesters and regularly plainclothes police officers around the protest and amongst the protesters every day. At no point did they say, we think that we need to declare that this protest is a riot. We're going to give them an hour to clear the streets, or else we're going to start arresting people because we've decided this is a riot. So at no point did the police even think that there was a riot going on, never mind a national emergency.
Mm-hmm. So in this case, give us some perspective that the book it's not an opinion piece. It's what struck me is that it's a well-researched book that is emphasizing facts juxtaposed to the rhetoric. Is that what your intention was, is to really delve into the facts here?
Yes, my intention was to chronicle the story. Why did the protests begin? The rather unique decision by the government in Canada to require truck drivers crossing into our nation's borders to be vaccinated or have a quarantine for 10 or 14 days, and resulting in their being only able to work maybe 2 days a month once they get out of quarantine. That was a catalyst. I described, what happened, the opinions of different trucking organizations and different premiers in the province about that. And so then I walked through the way the mainstream media, the official story of record, how we all heard what was going on through the lens of CBC, CTV Global, and so on. And then I move on to describe what was a growing counter narrative of people who were on the ground, Rupa Subramanya, Anna Farrow, and others Viva Fry, who were describing what was going on, and so I through that, and I just and then I started to discuss what happened at the Public Order Emergency Commission, why there was an inquiry, and I moved methodically through the whole 9 yards of it, with the testimony of police, the testimony of intelligence, the different cabinet ministers, the senior bureaucrats, and talk about the freezing of bank accounts, and so I just keep on moving through, sort of the events, finally the judicial review of Justice Mosley that said that it was unconstitutional, and then I also discussed the Coots blockade and the arrest there, and also the trial of Tamara Litch and Chris Barber.
Okay. So I'm talking with Ray McGinnis, who's the author of the recently released book Unjustified. It's about the convoy and the illegal use of the Emergencies Measures Act. I'm also joined by Dr. Marco Navarro-Genie, as well as Jason Lavigne. And we're talking about this book. We want to hear your thoughts, your questions about the book, this issue. I recommend the book to you. You can find the information about how to purchase it, certainly on Amazon and through the website of the Frontier Center for Public Policy. Another quote that that struck me was by the Honorable Brian Peckford, and he said, "Often when momentous national events of questionable motivation occur, people simply want a down-to-earth common sense assessment. Just give me the facts. In today's world, objective facts are hard to come by as a society spirals towards a totalitarian, hazy, moral future. Enter Ray McGinnis to the rescue. In a fast-paced yet methodical manner, Ray sifts through the political spin and facts and exposes the falsity of the Canadian federal government's invocation of the Emergencies Act to quell a fictitious national an emergency supposedly created by a peaceful truckers' protest." So the quote continues on, but I want to shift to Dr. Marco Navarro-Genie, because you're an author, you're an analyst, you're a researcher. You've even written about the mass panic that occurred during COVID-19. How do you see this book? Is Brian Peckford's endorsement, is that kind of, dare I say, histrionics, as we say, well, this is a kind of the use of the Emergencies Measures Act is kind of a form of bolstering up a political narrative, and it wasn't really based on facts. What's your take on this?
No, it was not. First, let me say thank you for inviting me to be here. It's a pleasure to be on the launch of Ray's important book, and good to be in the company of Jason as well. I think Brian Peckford is correct. The idea of this book, when people will look at this book, there are several different strands of notions of why this book is important, and Ray has done a favor and a great deed to all of us who are seeking to understand what went on, but also to leave a careful record of the things that took place. There are many different things that people can get out of this book, from people who are interested in human rights, from people who are interested in issues of constitutionality, from people who are interested in free speech and the right to protest, and so forth. There is so much here. From my point of view, as a kind of former academic and think tank guy, and also as a citizen, I'd like to maybe draw attention to the question of the failure of the media. And of course, we have a journalist here with us, and maybe we can pick up that theme a little bit later. Governments often violate people's rights. This is not the first time in human history or in the history of this country that governments violate rights. We can take that almost to the bank. It happens, sometimes accidentally and sometimes well thought out and on purpose. But so I view the failure of the media, as Ray already described the issue, for example, of arson, and so many other issues in which the media did not do its job, did not provide a varied perspective on things, and they were all pretty much singing out of the same hymn book. That I think is perhaps one of the single most important things about the themes that this book draws from.
So well said, Marco. So you're really getting at, I think, a very important takeaway that you're really underlining how Ray helps bring evidence to the failure of so many institutions that Canadians rely on, like the estates of the media. It begs the question of where were so many others, including, I don't know, the opposition parties to, there's a myriad of them, academe to, there's a whole myriad of other institutions. Is that kind of the list that you're thinking about that have failed us in this kind of situation?
Absolutely. Ray also draws attention to the failure of the courts in the judicial system. And perhaps the largest failure of all, really, is Parliament. Parliament has been, in our tradition and in the history of this country, going back 800 years with the Westminster system, the principal defender of the rights of the people. And the House of Commons completely failed.
Indeed. Well, it's a very important lesson. So I want to turn to you, Jason Lavigne, and a warm welcome to you. You've been following this story very closely as well. You've even spent a lot of time within the courthouse in Lethbridge with the Coots trial as well. What's your take? Why is this book so important?
This book's important because Ray is bearing witness to what's going on in Canada. History here is being made. And I think not only has Ray exposed the troubles with the media and some of the other institutions that you listed there, Ray has also exposed the heart of Canada is being jeopardized. And we really need to take a look at what makes us Canadian, what are we willing to stand up for, and how are we going to go about doing that? When we have the institution falling apart around us, especially around media, which traditionally is the way we would be informed, people like Ray coming forward, spending the time to travel to Ottawa, to Lethbridge, reaching out to family members, various people covering it, is a big testament to what used to be the normal media and the way of sharing information across Canada. So someone like Ray coming forward, I think, and even Tamara Leach with her book, we need people like that because bearing witness is the way that we capture history, share it, and God forbid we have to learn from a mistake from time to time. And if we're not documenting that and sharing that, how are we going to do that? So what I'm really thankful for Ray's exposure on what happened since 2022 and even further back to 2020 is Canada and the institutions itself is deteriorating. When you asked which ones are struggling, the list of which ones are not is far shorter. It's across the board. I can't even come up with an institution from forestry to parks that actually is doing well. Everything seems to be in trouble. And I think that really comes from the basis that we don't have proper media anymore. I'm just a nerd who's living out in Alberta. I didn't plan to be a journalist or a podcaster with a show. It was a lack of that kind of got me into that because I wasn't finding that information. So when Ray came in and asked us to spend some time to explain to him what I'm witnessing here in Alberta with the Lethbridge situation for the Coots gentleman, I was honored, and I was really pleased to see that people like Ray do exist. Glad to say there are a few of them, but Ray certainly has stepped forward and done a great job on collecting information around this topic. So thank you, Ray.
Indeed. Well, thank you, Jason, and thank you, Ray. The phrase that I found very interesting you mentioned, Jason, is bearing witness to what's happened based on facts rather than narrative. And one of the questions I have then for you, Jason, is, and perhaps it's a bit of speculation here, but based on your extensive following of this story and certainly based on the knowledge and research of books like Ray McGinnis here, What really happened? Like, it's a, often when we say narrative, it sounds almost harmless, that somehow you have these political operatives in a dark room somewhere spinning a kind of political narrative. And yet this had serious consequences on people. Like, you had thousands of bank accounts frozen. You had Canada became kind of an international joke as people looked at us and said, "What is going on with your country?" As you violate all kinds of basic rights and freedoms. And there was this huge disconnect with legacy media. You had the CBC at one point suggesting, well, could this be Russian funded? I mean, this is almost too hard to make up in terms of a story. So the question then is, this wasn't just a political narrative. They went for the jugular, and they still continue with these trials. They're going to appeal Justice Mosley's, decision that the invocation of the act was illegal. So why are they going to the mat when it comes to this narrative?
It's an excellent question, David. And yeah, just to remind everybody, there's appeals here for the Coutts matter as well. Before sentencing even happened, appeals were being filed. I think what actually happened, and that's a great question, is fear. Fear got stoked in everybody. There was fear amongst Canadians about what was happening. There was fear amongst the authorities on what could happen to them. There was fear amongst the men out there about what could happen to their families. There was fear, even, I'd say, in the media. They didn't know what was going on. So what we saw, I think, on February 14, 2022 specifically, was the accumulation of about 2 weeks of fear within the police, fear within the Crown's office, fear on the street, even fear within the people in the town who didn't know what was going on. There was fear everywhere. That's the one thing that everybody had in common. And I think what you end up happening, what you see happening when that happens, is it just spirals. And if we ever played that game as a kid where we play telephone, things change. And this is where you do end up with things like narratives that are false. Was there somebody who constructed it? I don't think we needed that. There was so much fear happening at the time that what they thought could happen was scary enough. Now, the good news is, after time, because time's always on our side on this one, we start to see the truth. And when we see the truth, we can start to learn from it. And that's why I'm going to focus on fear, because I think the RCMP, the Crown's office, Alberta government, the men involved, the people around them, the families behind them, everybody was scared. And they didn't know what was going to happen to their country or their neighborhood. And that's what we saw, I think, is the result of that. I hope we're paying attention, and thank goodness Ray wrote the book, because we should learn from this. So I think information, trust, and the way we get this out to everybody is what we need to learn from, because that was obviously broken. Nobody could believe the CBC or other channels, or even their neighbors, or even their loved ones, all at the same time. So fear, I think, is the answer to your question of what happened here, and I hope we learn from it.
Well, my prayer, my hope is that we learn from this as well. So what do you think about that? Is Jason right that a key theme here was fear? And it's a very powerful word, and it's a very powerful emotion, because if we think about emergencies, there was the sense that this was an emergency, and that our health and wellness was at stake. So, Ray, I guess as you were researching the book, though, how do you put into perspective, though, that theme of an emergency? That there was it really truly an emergency? Like, we have certain tests of invoking the Emergencies Measures Act, but was it really justified then?
Well,
Invoking
it's very interesting. I mean, as I mentioned at one point in my book, our prime minister, when the pandemic began, and we were in the middle of 2 weeks to flatten the curve, by late March 2020, early April 2020, the prime minister was on, conference calls with the premiers and territorial leaders, suggesting that given although all the provincial health officers of the provinces had declared provincial emergencies in response to COVID-19 at that point, the prime minister was raising the flag of saying, I'd like to invoke the Emergencies Act. So so there was an interest and eagerness, I would say, in invoking the Emergencies Act for the first time ever, even in late March, early April of 2020. And so when the Prime Minister got around with the different players that were involved in consulting with him, it was actually not the first time that this current sitting government had thought of invoking the Emergencies Act. So, and I want to add to the fear. We know from text messages between the Prime Minister's office, Marco Mendocino's office, and different media around the 24th of January, there was this interest in framing the protest as a quote January 6th North, or these are white supremacists, misogynists, racists, and so on. So there was an interest
And don't forget, they were also Nazis, as I recall.
Yeah, I can't forget that too. So, I mean, Marco Mendocino, public safety minister, opined several days before the protesters arrived that we would see Nazi flags on Parliament Hill. And lo and behold, there was a Nazi flag held by three gentlemen on the west wall of the Chateau Laurier. A photo of that taken by somebody who was in a secure location down below, and then it appeared on still photo on CTV and elsewhere very quickly and was the talk of the town. Although people like Rodney Palmer and Anna Farrow with the Catholic Register and so on never saw a Nazi flag while they're walking back and forth all the blocks in Wellington Street and so on. So there was in addition to the fear, there was this interest in early on framing the narrative, framing the story in a certain way. And I want to add in a third thing, which is an aspect of fear, which is catastrophizing. I mean, I listened to the deputy clerk of the Privy Council at the time, Nathalie Drouin, talked about, kind of in her cross-examination at the Public Order Emergency Commission, talked about how the parents were using children as human shields. Now, from all the video I've seen, what the parents were doing was playing with snow sculptures with their children, throwing snowballs happily, walking in strollers, sometimes going inside the cab of a truck to stay warm and have some chicken noodle soup or some samosas. I mean, but to use this inflammatory language of human shields, children being used as human shields, as if we were in the middle of the Syrian civil war, is just over the top. And over again, I saw this in the National Security Advisor, the Prime Minister at the time, Jody Thomas, was pressed to say, what was the violence that would be a trigger for invoking a national emergency? And she said on the stand, well, there was pollution. Well, what did she mean? Well, there were diesel engines running. I mean, it cannot be that we can agree as a citizenry that whenever there are too many diesel engines running because of gridlock somewhere or a protest, that should be a trigger for invoking the Emergencies Act and freezing bank accounts.
Okay. Yeah. No, it's hard to believe this history. It's getting to be a number of years ago. It's hard to believe, but it's still going on. In fact, there's a comment from an audience member here, Mark Wren, in response to the question, what do you think? Did the media and government fail us? And Mark Wren says, simple. It's a crime still underway and has never waned. So thank you, Mark, for that comment. So what do you think? So, Marco, I guess the question I'd have is, there's obviously a lot of Canadians where this narrative that the convoy was dangerous and the demonization of them did not work. But on the other hand, I think there's many Canadians and you want to be compassionate and sympathetic, still continue to wear some masks. There's people who get boosters with COVID-19. So help us understand, at what point does this fully break down? Like, obviously the narrative persists in some ways. In fact, I think I spoke with someone on an airplane a while ago saying, well, yeah, the convoy was kind of untoward. And at what point does this break down? Did you see any hope that the truth will finally work its way through our society?
I think I'd like to take a crack at answering that question by sort of weaving back to something Jason said about fear being at the heart of this.
Hmm.
And if we think about fear, then let me flip it around. And fear is the absence of courage. And so when so many institutions fail all at once, what we have is not just a failure of the institutions, it's a failure of the culture that supports the institutions. And that failure is the predominance of fear or the absence of courage. I find it very interesting that without really thinking about it, you began this segment by talking about Remembrance Day, which is really a celebration of courage.
Indeed.
When courage was almost you know omnipresent, I would say, in a situation like the wars that we have participated in. And so this absence of courage, it is not, it's a moral failure, because courage is a moral virtue. And as Aristotle would remind us, uh, of the cardinal virtues, courage is the most important one. So we have become a nation essentially of fearful people who believe tall tales and stories of monsters and what have you, right? These people were playing, the children, by the way, were playing around in bouncy castles. We forgot to mention that. And bouncy castles became sort of the one of the principal markers or images of the protest. So the culture is fearful, and as we heard also Ray say, it was exploited deliberately by
Hmm.
people in government, and so we have failure of institutions, we have a moral failure of the culture, and a government that was far too willing to manipulate that absence of courage.
I think that's brilliantly put. And I like the way you connect our culture, how we treat each other, those behaviors every day, with the importance of courage. And I think you're right on that this was not just a political failure, it was a moral failure. And we can all, dare I say, take some responsibility as Canadians to what extent we spoke up about this and dared to question what was going on and have healthy discussions to say, is this true? I always marvel at how, as a former elected official, I was always surprised that it seemed like elected officials were reluctant to go out and congratulate the convoy and have tea with them and sit down and say, what are your concerns? And I think they were well known that the concern was largely these mandates are going to close them down as independent truckers and who were spending enormous amount of time in their vehicles. So was there any scientific evidence, Marco, that these mandates were even justified then?
As you know, we've published two books about COVID, and we read all the my co-author and I read all the materials and a great deal of the peer-reviewed articles and whatnot, and it was at the very least contested truths. We have forgotten that that's what science is, like any other human endeavor.
Mm-hmm.
It
Mm-hmm.
was a contested set of truths, and we through deliberately the whole aspect of contestation, or in other words, those aspects that were in doubt, governments and different institutions threw them out in favor of the truths or half truths that would inspire most fear to people, and that would enable governments with these ordinances to manipulate the populace.
Indeed. I will never forget the quote from a friend of ours, Dr. Martin Koldorf, I think certainly one of the leading virologists in the world, certainly one of the authors of the Great Barrington Declaration and formerly at Harvard University, who said, it is remarkable how the Canadian truckers inspired not only him, but the world as they went down the road and actually followed the science in complete contrast with others who did not. So that's really quite an insightful comment. So, Jason, as we look at this story, as Ray has so brilliantly summarized up in factual form in his book, what kind of damage has this done to our society as we look at institutions and decision makers a little bit differently as we realize that there was a lot of narrative, in fact, things that were not based on fact. What's your sense of that?
That's another good question, but I actually want to kind of do exactly what Marco did and kind of flip this. What did it expose? Like, what did we learn? So, for example, talking about using children as human shields, let's just say for a second that that was true. As
Mm-hmm.
you can see from that headline, half the story's missing. So a shield from what? So the rest of the story there would have been from the government who is resisting the protesters. So right there is an example of we have biased media. You can't trust it anymore. And as a consequence to that, Canadians were forced to wake up and learn. So yes, there's damage. There's a lot of harm. There's a lot of death. There's a lot of trust that was eroded during this. But we've also exposed some of the problems. We've now seen the belly of the beast. The media is where we need to spend a lot of time and focus on correcting it. The judicial system absolutely is influenced by the media, and our government is impacted by the media. It wasn't until international media was picking up the story, because that's how big it was getting for the convoy, that the government really started to acknowledge that it even existed. Prior to that, they were talking about a convoy in BC about potholes. That's what you were
Mm-hmm.
talking about. But that was such not the case. It wasn't until Fox and BBC and others started to pick up the story that it happened. So this shows, I think it exposed how powerful the media truly still is. And when Ray started to do his articles, he was getting a lot of international coverage from it. You were seeing it
Mm-hmm.
happen a lot over in the UK, down in the US. That built up a lot of the attention all the way to Tucker Carlson asking the premier herself here in Alberta on stage, what's going on with these four gentlemen here in Coots? That's how powerful the media is. So we got to see the underbelly of it. It was not very good to see. It wasn't there for us, but we also got to still see the power of it, even when you have individuals, just like the gentleman on the screen right now, who are fighting for this to get the information out. So I want to be more optimistic, and I say, hey, look, we now saw the problems. Let's go ahead and fix them. And it doesn't seem to be unsurmountable. It really is about providing information. So let's go ahead and learn from this. I keep coming back to that because I think that's exactly where Marco is getting at, to be courageous. So be courageous to share the information, be courageous to challenge the information, and be courageous to follow the information. Let's do what the convoy did. Let's follow it all the way to Ottawa. So I think it exposed more than it did damage, in my opinion.
All right. It reminds me of the phrase, "The truth will set us free." So as we look at this, let's have courage. Let's speak up, and do not be afraid. So on that note, I'm speaking with Ray McGinnis, as well as Jason Lavigne from the Lavigne Show, as well as Dr. Marco Navarro-Genie with Frontier, about the recent book, Unjustified. We encourage you to look at it. It's a page turner as we learn more and more things about what happened with the convoy and the illegal use of the Emergencies Measures Act. So as we look to the future here, where do you see signs of hope? Where do you see signs of renewal? And I want to start with Ray and then Marco and then Jason, because I look at this and I think, if speaking of the legacy media, we've heard about on November 5, the election of Donald Trump. We saw the legacy media there spinning so much stuff, it was just hard to keep up with. And we know the emergence in the United States, just like in Canada, the emergence of independent media has been profound. The numbers are stunning. It's made a huge difference as Donald Trump had a long interview with numerous independent media, including Joe Rogan. So there's a lot of hope happening here as people kind of find out more and more what's happening. So Ray, where do you see the signs of hope here?
Well, maybe one sign of hope is, as I note in my book, by the time the convoy happened, Health Canada itself already had indicated, if you went down the labyrinth of rabbit hole to try and find the actual numbers of people who had died from the vaccine, was about several hundred at the time of the convoy. I didn't know that at the time. And as of January of this year, it's 488 people officially have died, and I won't go into all the,
Sorry, can you repeat that, Ray? I want to make sure we don't miss that. You're saying how many people have died according to whom?
officially, according to Health Canada, as of January 5th of this year, 488 people had died from the COVID vaccine. Now, I won't go into all of the things that they do to sort of tilt the scales, but nonetheless, that itself, it used to be that in the news, I mean, I would hear local news reports. Somebody's taken a medication or taken some product at a grocery store, and now they're in hospital. And that would be a story on the local news. So usually when one person has taken a medication or a vaccine and dies, back in the pre-pandemic days, that used to merit some mention. Mm-hmm. But so my hope is that with enough people realizing, even according to our own British Columbia Center for Disease Control, 444 people by the 21st of March of 2021 or 25th of March 2021, 144 people had severe reactions to the vaccine. And so, and that's lowballing it, the way that they tilt the scales. But nonetheless, I would hope that in the future that there would be enough pressure that the media would start, when somebody, as a young 30-year-old goes for a jog who has nothing but A-list signs of health all over the place, and then, post having a medication or a vaccine days or hours before just happens to die from a cardiac arrest, that the media would start reporting those stories again. And they are reported, but it's kind of like they have no idea. But I think some more digging into what people know, because it's like there's a lot of this, like the elephant is in the room. And I'm hoping that the way forward is that the media will start acknowledging these elephants in the room, and maybe they can say, well, it looks like people with Crohn's disease or whatever shouldn't be taking medication A or vaccine B, but at least to be curious, because the hope is that there's enough awareness on the part of the media and hand wringing, and they're doing that public forums with the CBC and so on. Why aren't people trusting us anymore? That maybe this is enough of a wake-up call for them that they'll start thinking, oh, they're going to start trusting if we start really doing the real journalism again.
Mm-hmm. So you see hope that as this information comes out, let's have a wake-up call in the media. Speaking of the media, this is a quote from the book as very much an accolade for the book. It says, Ray McGinnis has crafted the ultimate expose on the West campaign against dissent. With careful reporting, he blows up the false propaganda narrative that the trucker convoy was dangerous, but he also reveals a whitewash cleanup by the POEC on behalf of the government's invocation of the Emergencies Act against peaceful protesters. And that, of course, is by Trish Wood, an award-winning investigative journalist with CBC's Fifth Estate. And you can also get her podcast, Trish Wood is Critical. So where do you see signs of hope, Marco? What's your vantage point on that?
Is the antidote for fear. More freedom is the antidote for oppression. Fear is something that we can get over with courage, and freedom is the antidote for whatever institutions seek to oppress us. Look, the antidote for the problem of freedom has never been less freedom. And so the hope in a liberal society like ours is that even though there's been oppression and there's been fear, that there are kernels of liberty in the minds and hearts of many of us. And it is up to us to exercise that courage we were talking about, to bring it forth and to share it with our fellow Canadians.
Well said. So does that mean that as a practical measure, it sure would be good to have good civics classes in high school again, and let's teach this stuff and not take our rights and freedoms and understandings of our incredible history for granted, including Remembrance Day?
We need to take our institutions back. and courage and freedom are the things we need for it.
Right on. What do you think, Jason? Where are your signs of hope? I know you've articulated that. I think each one of you are signs of hope. That's for sure. But what are you thinking, Jason?
Well, I'm going to highlight what Canada has done in response to this. So the third part of his book, Ray's book, is and the inquiry that got it wrong. So when there was an inquiry that got it wrong, what did Canadians do? They created a new one. So things like the NCI and other types of ways to take a closer look. Canadians roll up their sleeves when they're in rough states, and that's exactly what we saw happen. If the inquiry doesn't work, we'll do our own. If we're not getting the answers from the government, we'll go search the answers ourselves. So seeing Canadians step up, what I'm very excited about is it looks like they're going to continue to do that. So getting out to vote, standing up to become a candidate, get involved in local school boards, getting involved in your library board, all of this is happening like I've never seen before. Even 5 years ago, you would ask somebody, would you ever consider being a candidate for your library board? And a lot of people would understand or not even understand that there is one. But now you see all over the place. There's organizations getting people together, introducing them to the concept, bringing forward candidates. Canadians, when they get cornered, they fight back. So this is the best thing I've seen. You're seeing it happen all over the place, whether it's defense funds to help the injured, whether it's the trial and the coverage that's happening to it, people are paying attention. So I'm very optimistic that as long as Canadians do what Canadians do, which is roll up your sleeves and get to work, we're going to be in good shape. It's a long road ahead, but I'm very optimistic that we have the right path.
Well, I like your optimism, Jason. And I think a lot of people are recognizing more and more the pattern of buckling down on dissent. We've got some nasty bills, quite frankly, from a policy point of view. I see them as train wrecks. If you think of, it's hard to know where to begin. There's so many of them. But Bill C-63, the so-called Online Harms Act, is really, I think, a full frontal attack on freedom of speech. And you've got all kinds of noises talking about somehow criminalizing people who deny certain people's so-called truth and narratives again. So how do we look at how do you look at this kind of legislation that's emerging here? As it seems like the government itself really hasn't learned any lessons from this time in our history around the convoys and the protests. They're kind of doubling down. Is that what am I misreading this? What do you think, Ray and Marco?
Oh yes, the doubling down just continues. The after the Mosley judicial review decision that the government acted unconstitutionally, I think within a month, Attorney General Barani was talking in favor of going ahead and appealing the decision of Justice Mosley, but also restating again that the protesters were very violent. And I mean, in the Public Order Emergency Commission, the Justice Rouleau heard the Morris and other constables saying that there was no physical violence, no criminal violence, and they were shocked by the absence of it. But in the report, they reached for a couple of Ottawa residents that talked about how when they close their eyes at night, they can still, hear the sound of honking horns and the psychological violence. So, this is how the wordsmithing keeps on going with this government that they keep doubling down, but in ways that they keep wordsmithing words that we've understood. Like even I think in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, they kind of, the word truth it becomes a little flexible too, in terms of a person's personal perspective, and it's not like really solid. So we keep floating words out that people generally understand. Violence generally understood in a certain way, but we keep repeating it, knowing, or the Attorney General should know, there was no violence. That's what the intelligence was telling them. So I think that the best way to deal with this is to keep catching them at it and getting the word out through different alternative media as soon as we can, to say, lie it again.
Right on. So thank you for that reminder, Ray. And speaking of which, to the audience, like the program, share it with people. This is an important discussion because it really strikes to the heart of the fate of our democracy, doesn't it? So, Marco, as you see these points of legislation, is the government learning from the lessons of COVID-19 and how we managed that, and where do you what do you think we should be doing to fight back?
Not at all. I think this is, again, governments trying to manipulate certain types of fears. Look, freedom poses problems. And one of the problems that freedom poses is that there is a variety, a multiplicity of points of views in a free society, and we should not be afraid of that. The alternative to having so many different ideas is not to ban ideas. The alternative is to bring even more ideas to the forefront and examine them and exercise, again, that freedom and courage we were talking about. So we should not be afraid that there are people questioning certain official truths on the contrary, rather. We should encourage them. There are certain issues that people are not going to want to talk about. And so when people don't want to talk about certain things, that is the cue that those are the things we should be talking about.
Right on. So that's a really good advice, Marco, that those are red flags. If someone is not wanting to talk about certain things, then probably we need to be a little bit more curious. Is that your point?
Yes, exactly that.
So, Jason, as you look at this kind of legislation that's emerging, how do you look at that? I mean, what is your perspective on this that should give us pause for thought and give us a sense of what we should be doing about it?
Thank you, David. As somebody who's running for the House of Commons, I look at it from the standpoint of the lawmakers and why do they do what they do. So there's kind of two reasons why. The reactory way, so it's something that happens, so they're reacting to it, or precautionary, so they want to take care of something before it becomes an issue. When it's precautionary, that's usually agenda or some sort of mandate or some sort of thought of the future. But let's look at maybe the potential that this was reactory. So when you're looking at bills like C11, 1863, 293, these are all bills that are kind of responding to something. Now, what is it the government's signaling to us when they have these kind of bills? Well, they're responding that they're afraid. They're afraid of what we have to say, how we get it out there. What are we going to do in the next pandemic? So it takes me back to the POEC when Eva Chipowicz asked Trudeau directly, when did the government become so afraid of its own citizens? Because I think she nailed it right there. That's exactly how they're responding. That's how they responded in Ottawa. That's how they responded with legislation. And if you pay really close attention, they're very, very scared of their citizens. Now, why? Maybe there's a reason why they are afraid. Maybe they're not doing a good job. Maybe the citizens are speaking up and pushing back. And they are becoming afraid of their citizens because of what they're doing to their citizens. If I was an abuser of somebody, I'd be very afraid if they fought back. And that's what it feels like is happening here. And maybe this legislation that we're seeing, it's reactory and it's also precautionary. They're trying to alleviate what they think might be the problems if they continue down this, let's call it agenda or mandate, which doesn't align with the Canadian values or the Canadian spirit. So they're responding. Canadians are responding and the government's responding. And they're responding with the only tool they have, laws. And they're going to use our own system against us if we don't continue to stand up. But I am, again, optimistic. There's a lot of pushback. So let's keep that going. Let's keep that push on the government, because when there isn't public pressure, the government would fall to personal pressure, professional pressure, and political pressure. So in the absence of political pressure, you're letting them do that. So let's not do that. Let's keep this pressure on. And a book like Ray's is a good way to do that, because it highlights how we have the power. The entire book exists because a few Canadians stood up and said enough. So thank you very much, Ray, for highlighting that. And I do want to see that pressure stay on. Let's not take it off until Canada's fixed. And when Canada's fixed, I'll stop doing my show and I'll get back to my homesteading. But until then, we got to keep that pressure on.
So well said. Let's keep up the pressure. Let's keep involved. You're running for Parliament. What are other things that citizens can do? I mean, it's astounding as well, your insight, Jason, that you say in some measure these kinds of authoritarian actions or legislation, the use of the law, reflects a government that you would say is afraid of its people. I find that a fascinating thesis. So I guess the question is, yeah, again, what do we as citizens do? How do we speak up, Ray? Should we be like, is your hope that people will read your book and say, by golly, I don't like this. I'm going to speak up and I'm going to call my representative, write them and tell them that we need to work together to rebuild and renew this country?
Well, certainly, and they can also do things like there are two men in the Drumheller Institution in Drumheller, Alberta, Chris Carbert and Tony Oleanic, that will be there for a while. I know there's an appeal, but they're there for the time being, and so people can write them letters to let them know that they're not forgotten. And also we should also write letters to our members of parliament to let them know that we haven't forgotten about those men. We haven't forgotten about the unending mischief trial of Tamara Lich and Chris Barber, and things like I was reading today about the Democracy Fund has just helped push back regarding the government with this Arrive can was going to charge. There's an Amish man who had died, but nonetheless the government was going to putting a lien on the family's property, even though the person was deceased. Anyway, it's like, so we need, these stories have to get out so that people know that they can do something. They can write letters to people who are in jail, support people who need crowdfunding for their very expensive legal costs, and for example.
No, but these are great examples, Ray. So let's just recap. You can reach out to elected officials. You can give donations to the causes. There's a lot of very good legal action funds, the Justice Center, the Constitutional Foundation for Rights and Freedoms, the Democracy Fund, that have really made a lot of progress together fighting back on, frankly, the misuse of law, dare I say lawfare, when you use law as a weapon against your ideological political opponents. I mean, that's clearly not the Canadian tradition. We should not be doing that. That's outrageous. I do have a question from Peter Biker from the audience. The government's precaution becomes adversarial the moment a profit becomes part of the equation. Very interesting, Peter. So that was actually going to be one of my questions to our team here, is to what extent this nonsense reflects special interest groups who have defined profit or gain where the rest of us pay for it, like the classic case in public policy where you have dispersed costs but concentrated benefits, Marco. And I'm thinking of Big Pharma. I mean, a lot of money was made. It's almost unbelievable, the amount of money that was thrown through Big Pharma. So to what extent is some of this public policy or government behavior explained by the mysterious world of special interests?
Did you direct that at me?
Yes, Marco. Yes.
I think we have to be careful in identifying profit as only one thing, because human beings are, as we were talking about, extremely varied, and there is never one single response to the variety of different human human tastes, if you will. Money is one, certainly, and pharmas would be one, but power and ambition and all these other vices also come into play, because some people are not in government because they want money. They're in government because they want power and they want control, and they want to exercise this control on the lives of other people. And so there are different varieties of benefits, is what I would say to that. But there are certainly benefits. People say follow the money. I would say follow the benefit in that sense, if you want to understand people's motivations.
Very well said. So follow the benefit. It doesn't just include money, but all kinds of benefits. So on that note, Jason, you're a successful podcaster. And one of the things that we talked about earlier is, I mean, Ray exposes this brilliantly in the book, is the role of the media. And I'm not sure if many Canadians realize it, but some 2,000 media outlets are funded in part by the federal government now. It's really quite stunning. The range of media, you've got even weeklies, dailies, all kinds of them. I think the last time I checked, the Winnipeg Free Press gets almost half their budget from the government. Can we actually have an independent functional media if the government's funding half your budget?
I do believe we can actually, because as you see with the viewership from the CBC, it's dropping to numbers that you've never seen before, and there's different media popping up all the time. But I actually want to focus on another piece of media that is often overlooked, the citizen journalist. And that is somebody who will go to an event and just tell a friend or tell their family or go back and just share it with somebody. That's a citizen journalist. And the Coutts trial was full of them. Full of them. And that was actually one of the big benefits that we saw happen with the Coutts trial. And it actually made its way into the closing submissions of both the prosecution and the defense. And the judge even made a comment about it, that the people who showed up was amazing. Every single day, that place was almost full. And every single day, all those people went home and told somebody and talked about it on the street, or even some of them picked up a camera and talked about it online. That citizen journalist piece, we didn't have that before. We didn't have that before, but now we do. So I do think that in the face of well-funded or heavily funded media, the mainstream media, that we can go ahead and prosper as independent journalists. When you don't have another choice, you'll go find it. And that's why I was saying Canadians are ready to roll up sleeves and get to work. So whether we have to grab a camera or go to the courthouse or take a notebook and record it that way because nobody else is doing it, we will. And I saw that all over the place, from Ottawa to Windsor to Lethbridge, citizen journalists showing up and doing exactly that kind of work. So I'm very happy with that. And now CBC and others are responding to that. You're starting to see them be more like a citizen journalist or an independent journalist, going back to the street and having stories like that. So we're actually kind of even pushing the established media to change their ways. I think they understand that their time's limited if they don't. So not only are we helping fill the void, we're also going to hopefully help them go back on track. Because like I said earlier, I'd like to get back to homesteading and get back to what I was really trying to do with my family. But until that point, you can count on me to continue with my show.
Well, that's terrific. Well said, Jason. So let's be involved as citizens. And I think if one of the important points that you make, Ray, in your book Unjustified, is that really everything's at stake here, including our democracy, our country. And the answer to that question ultimately is, how will we as citizens choose to speak up, engage, as Marco alluded to? How do we bring courage and not fear to the table as we dare to work as Canadian citizens for this incredible country? So I want to thank Jason Lavigne from the Jason Lavigne Show, as well as Dr. Marco Navarro-Genie, Vice President at Frontier Center for Public Policy, and of course, Ray McGinnis, the author of the book Unjustified, and our whole audience for joining us today to celebrate and mark the occasion of the launch of this book, Unjustified. You can find that again on Amazon. You can find more information on Frontier's website, but be sure to read it. And we're so glad that everyone could join together for this far-reaching discussion. And may you have a great week next week, same time, same place, on Thursday. Thanks for joining us on Leaders on the Frontier.
Thank you for watching Leaders on the Frontier. We're a nonpartisan think tank. We explore ideas, policy, and practical solutions that can make a difference in the lives of Canadians. We do not accept any government funding. We work for you. Thank you for supporting Frontier. Visit fcpp.org to give. While you're there, be sure to check out our latest articles and research. Without open discussion and debate, you're not thinking, nor are you free. Comment below. We'd love for you to join the conversation.